Something in your life is shaking right now. Maybe it's the number in your bank account. Maybe it's the person lying next to you who feels further away every night. Maybe it's the job that used to feel like purpose and now feels like a slow leak. Maybe it's your own body doing something it never used to do. A tightness in the chest, a racing heart at 2 a.m., a mind that won't stop replaying the worst version of tomorrow. And here's the part nobody warns you about. It's not the problem itself that breaks you. It's the moment you realize your own mind isn't on your side anymore, that the one thing you always trusted, your ability to think clearly, is gone right when you need it most. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not too sensitive or not built for this. You are a human being whose nervous system is doing exactly what nervous systems do under threat. And that system can be retrained, not with slogans, not with just breathe advice shouted at you by someone who has never watched their own hands shake. With something real, something built from psychology, neuroscience, and the lived experience of people who walked through their own collapse and came out the other side steady. Somewhere out there right now, someone is standing in a hospital hallway trying to process words a doctor just said. Someone is sitting in a parked car outside their own house, unable to go inside yet because their face hasn't stopped shaking. Someone is staring at a phone screen, rereading a message that just ended something they thought was permanent. If any part of that is you, if you are the one in the hallway, the car, the unbearable silence after the message, this book was written directly to you, and it doesn't ask you to feel less. It asks you to feel fully and to build, underneath all of it, a foundation that doesn't move. Here is the promise, made honestly rather than dramatically. This will not make your life easy. Nothing can promise you that, and anyone who does is lying to you. What it can do, what it will do, if you actually walk through it rather than just listening to it, is change your relationship with difficulty itself. It will teach you the actual machinery behind panic, so you stop mistaking a biological alarm for a verdict on your character. It will hand you tools used by surgeons, negotiators, and elite performers under real pressure, stripped of jargon, explained simply enough to use tonight. It will show you how to separate yourself from a feeling without shutting the feeling out, how to build an identity that circumstances can't repossess, and how to stop living inside a disaster that hasn't happened and may never happen at all. This is not a book about pretending things are fine. This is a book about becoming the kind of person whose calm doesn't depend on things being fine. Stay with me. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why your mind does what it does under pressure, and exactly what to do about it, one grounded, deliberate choice at a time. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The map in your head is not the territory. There's a man named Theodore who used to run a small furniture workshop outside Krakow. For 11 years, every board he cut, every client he shook hands with, every order that came in on time built a quiet, private certainty inside him. I understand how this works. I am in control of my life. Then a fire took the workshop in one night. Not gradually. One night. And what broke Theodore wasn't just the loss of the building or the tools or the income. It was something deeper and stranger. It was the sudden, terrifying discovery that the story he'd been telling himself, "I've got this handled," had never been true in the way he thought. Here's what almost nobody tells you Your brain is running a simulation of the world at all times. A private, constantly updated map of what's safe, what's dangerous, what to expect next. It builds this map from every experience you've ever had, and it needs that map to feel accurate in order to function. Without it, you can't plan. You can't rest. You can't move through a day without drowning in 1,000 unresolved possibilities. So your brain does something clever and, in the long run, a little dangerous. It convinces you that you're in control, not total control. You're not delusional, but enough control that if you work hard enough, plan carefully enough, and avoid the obvious traps, life will basically cooperate. That belief isn't stupidity, it's architecture. It's the scaffolding your mind needs to function at all. But scaffolding isn't the building. And when reality delivers something the map never predicted, the fire, the diagnosis, the phone call that changes everything, it isn't really life falling apart. It's the map falling apart. Your nervous system reads that gap between map and territory as an emergency because, for most of human history, an inaccurate map really was an emergency. It meant a predator you didn't see coming. This is why smart, capable, resourceful people can completely unravel the moment life breaks its promise to them. It was never about intelligence. It's about the specific, ancient alarm that goes off when your internal map of the world gets contradicted by the world itself. It's worth being specific about what the map actually contains, because it's more than just expectations about your career or your relationship. It includes 1,000 tiny unconscious predictions running constantly beneath your awareness. That the car will start, that the paycheck will land on time, that your body will do what you ask it to do, that the people you love will still be there tomorrow. Most of these predictions are so automatic you never even notice them as predictions at all. You only discover they existed the moment one of them fails to come true. That's part of why sudden loss feels so disorienting. It's not just the loss itself. It's the abrupt unmasking of an assumption you didn't even know you were making. There's a name for the fix, and it's older than psychology itself. A teacher named Kaito, who spent years training under a stern old calligraphy master in Kyoto, before the world ever heard of mindfulness as a marketable word, used to say something to his students that stuck with everyone who heard it. You do not control the wind. You control the sail. That's the whole shift. Not control over outcomes, clarity over responses. The goal was never to make life predictable. The goal is to become so clear about what's actually yours to direct, your attention, your choices, your next move, that you stop hemorrhaging energy trying to manage everything else. This matters because the energy you spend wrestling with things outside your control isn't neutral. It's actively corrosive. It keeps your body in a low simmer of alarm. It clouds your thinking. It makes you reactive instead of deliberate, desperate instead of steady. There's also a subtler cost that rarely gets named. The energy spent trying to control the uncontrollable doesn't just drain you, it actively convinces you that control was possible in the first place, which sets you up to feel like a personal failure when reality inevitably refuses to cooperate. Theodore spent the first few months after the fire quietly blaming himself for not somehow preventing it, running the wiring inspection through his head over and over, certain that a more careful version of himself would have caught it. It took him a long while to notice that this self-blame was really just the illusion of control wearing a different mask, insisting there must have been a lever he failed to pull, when in truth there had never been a lever there at all. Theodore didn't rebuild his workshop by controlling fate. He rebuilt it by asking a smaller, sharper question every single morning. What is actually mine to do today? Not, how do I guarantee this never happens again? That question has no answer and will eat you alive. Just, what is mine to do right now with what I have? There's a useful way to picture this. Imagine your mind as a control room with two very different panels. One panel has switches, dials, levers you can actually operate. Your effort, your attention, your words, your next decision. The other panel is a wall of windows looking out at whether you can watch but never adjust. Other people's choices, the economy, a diagnosis, the past. Most people spend their entire lives standing at the windows, hands pressed against the glass, trying to will the weather into cooperating, while the control panel behind them sits untouched, full of switches nobody's flipping. The work isn't pretending the windows don't exist. It's turning around. This reorientation also explains something that confuses a lot of people the first time they hear it. Why two individuals can face the exact same hardship, the same layoff, the same breakup, the same devastating test result, and walk away in completely different psychological shape. It was never about the size of the event. It's about where each person located their sense of agency. One spent their energy at the windows. The other found the panel. Researchers studying what's called locus of control have found this pattern repeatedly across decades of data. People who believe outcomes are mostly steered by outside forces consistently report higher anxiety, higher rates of helplessness, and lower long-term resilience. People who believe their responses, even inside brutal, unchosen circumstances, are the real lever, consistently show better mental health and dramatically better outcomes over time, not because their lives were objectively easier, because they spent their limited energy at the panel instead of the window. That's the first shift this book is going to ask of you. Stop measuring your stability by whether life is behaving. Start measuring it by the quality of your response to whatever life actually hands you. The wind doesn't owe you anything, but you were always in charge of the sail. Chapter 2. The machinery behind the panic. Have you ever been in the middle of something serious, a diagnosis, a fight, a moment where everything mattered, and found yourself completely unable to think? Words wouldn't come. Logic wouldn't come. It felt like someone had reached into your skull and unplugged the smart part of you. You weren't imagining that. It really happened. And understanding exactly why is not some academic detour. It's the foundation everything else in this book stands on. Picture your brain holding a small almond-shaped structure buried deep in its center. Think of it like a night shift security guard who never sleeps, never blinks, and takes his job extremely seriously, sometimes too seriously. This is your amygdala, and its entire purpose is scanning your environment non-stop for danger faster than your conscious mind can even register what's happening. By the time you're aware something threatening occurred, this guard has already sounded the alarm, already flooded your body with cortisol and adrenaline, already started preparing you to fight, flee, or freeze. This system is ancient. It evolved to protect a human being from a lion in the grass, a fall from a cliff, an enemy approaching camp. And for that job, it's magnificent. The problem is, Your internal night guard cannot tell the difference between a lion and a passive-aggressive email from your manager, between a falling rock and a bank notification. To this part of your brain, a threat is a threat, full stop. And here's the critical piece. When the alarm goes off, it doesn't just prepare your body, it actively dims the lights on your prefrontal cortex, the part of you responsible for reasoning, patience, nuance, long-term thinking. Your wisest self gets put on mute. Researchers call this an amygdala hijack. It's why a normally thoughtful person can say something cruel in an argument they'll regret for years. It's not that their character changed. Their wisest self was temporarily locked out of the room. There's a second layer here worth understanding because it explains why the exact same stressful event can hit you so differently depending on the week. Your amygdala doesn't evaluate a new stressor in isolation. It evaluates it against your current total load. Picture a cup that's already 3/4 full from a rough month at work, a strained relationship, a bad night's sleep. It doesn't take a dramatic new event to overflow that cup. A minor inconvenience, a delayed reply, a curt comment from a colleague can trigger a reaction that seems wildly disproportionate to the event itself. That's not you overreacting in some character flaw sense. It's the cup that was already nearly full before that particular drop landed. People often feel embarrassed by their own reaction to something small, without realizing the small thing was never really the cause. It was just the drop that finally spilled the cup that had been filling for weeks. Here's where it gets serious for anyone living through a long stretch of hardship rather than one bad afternoon. Chronic stress, the kind that comes from months of financial strain, a crumbling relationship, ongoing uncertainty, doesn't just spike the alarm occasionally. Brain imaging studies have shown that people under sustained stress actually develop a measurably larger amygdala over time, alongside thinner gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. The threat detection guard gets bigger and louder. The wise, reasoning part of the brain gets quieter and weaker. Your brain is being physically reshaped by what you're going through. Now here's the part that should genuinely give you hope. The brain reshapes itself in the other direction too, through deliberate, repeated calm. This is neuroplasticity, and it is one of the most liberating discoveries in modern science. A woman named Amara, a hospice nurse in Lagos who spent a decade absorbing other people's grief for a living, once described this to me in the simplest possible terms. Every time I choose the slow breath instead of the fast reaction, I am putting a new brick in a new wall. Nobody sees it happening, but one day the wall is just there. That's not poetry. That's literally what's happening at the cellular level. Landmark research out of Harvard found that people who practiced regular mindfulness showed increased thickness in the prefrontal cortex and reduced reactivity in the amygdala. Measurable, physical changes produced by nothing more than consistent mental practice. The version of you that spirals, that panics, that goes blank under pressure, that is not fixed. That's a current setting on a highly adaptable machine, and the setting can change, not through willpower alone and not overnight, but through the exact repeated experiences we'll build together in this book. Pausing before reacting, breathing through discomfort, choosing observation over catastrophe. Think about how a footpath forms across an open field. Nobody engineers it. It appears because enough feet walked the same route enough times that the grass gave way and the dirt packed down. Your brain works the same way. Every time you react with panic, you deepen the panic path a little more, and it becomes the route your mind defaults to the next time pressure shows up. Not because it's the only route available, but because it's the one worn smoothest. Every time you instead choose the slower, steadier response, you're pressing down a second path through the same field, one step at a time, long before it looks like anything at all. Nobody driving past that field would notice a new path forming in its first weeks. But paths don't need to be noticed to be real. They just need to be walked again and again, until one day the old panic route is overgrown and the calmer one is the obvious way through. This is why a single good breathing exercise during one bad afternoon rarely changes much on its own, and why people sometimes give up on these tools too early, concluding they don't work for me. They were never meant to work like a light switch. They work like a path, cumulative, quiet, and eventually undeniable. This understanding alone won't make you calm, but it does something essential first. It removes the shame. It kills the lie that you should just be able to handle it, that falling apart is a character flaw. You're not broken. You're running old firmware in a modern world, and you're about to install an upgrade. Chapter 3. The switch you didn't know you had. Of every system running your body right now, your heartbeat, your digestion, your hormone levels, there is exactly one that you can consciously reach in and adjust by hand. Your breath. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because your breath is the only bridge between the part of your nervous system you can't control and the part you can. Learn to work that bridge, and you have a direct lever into your own biology. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. Your autonomic nervous system runs on two main gears. One is the accelerator, the sympathetic branch, which floods you with alertness, tightens your muscles, speeds your breath, and prepares you for a fight that, most of the time, isn't actually coming. The other is the brake, the parasympathetic branch, which slows your heart, deepens your breath, relaxes your body, and lets your wisest self come back online. In a well-balanced life, you'd shift between these gears as needed and return to baseline once the demand passed. But for anyone living through sustained pressure, the accelerator becomes the default. The body gets stuck in high gear, and the longer it stays there, the harder it becomes to shift back. A chronically activated stress response actually makes you more reactive over time, not less. This is where the breath becomes your override switch. Deliberate, slow, deep breathing directly stimulates a long nerve running from your brainstem down through your heart and gut, the main channel your parasympathetic system uses to communicate with the rest of your body. Breathe correctly, and you are chemically, physically pulling your own nervous system out of alarm mode. Not metaphorically, chemically. Try this one first because it's fast and it works almost instantly. It's sometimes called the double inhale reset, and elite performers use it constantly without ever naming it. Take a full breath in through your nose. Right before you'd normally exhale, take one more short, sharp sip of air in through the nose, topping the lungs all the way off. Then let it all go in one long, slow exhale through your mouth until your lungs are completely empty. Do that once, and your heart rate will measurably drop within seconds. Do it 3 times in a row, and your entire physiological state can shift inside a minute. There's a second method, used by surgeons mid-operation, by pilots handling an emergency, by anyone whose job requires staying sharp under real pressure. It's a rhythm. Inhale slowly for a count of 4. Hold for 4, Exhale for 4. Hold empty for 4. One cycle. Run it for 5 or 6 cycles. It doesn't sedate you. It produces something more useful. Relaxed body, alert mind. Exactly the state you need for a hard conversation or a difficult decision. There's a third, gentler technique that's especially good for the 2 a.m. spiral when your mind is racing and sleep feels impossible. Inhale quietly through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 7. Exhale slowly through the mouth for 8. The long exhale is the key. The exhale phase is where your parasympathetic system does its best work. So stretching it out consistently pulls your whole system down. It's worth mentioning why this works so quickly compared to almost anything else available to you. Most calming strategies, a change in belief, a shift in perspective, a new habit, take weeks to show results because they root through the slower, more deliberate parts of the brain. Breath bypasses all of that. It reaches directly into the autonomic system through a purely physical channel, which is why it can shift your state in under a minute when almost nothing else can. This doesn't make the slower work in the rest of this book unnecessary. It makes the breath the fastest possible bridge to get you stable enough to actually use the slower tools when you need them. There's one more tool worth carrying with you, and it works through a completely different channel. Your senses instead of your lungs. When your mind is spinning in imagined catastrophe, bring it back into your body and your surroundings. Notice 5 things you can see, 4 things you can physically feel. The fabric under your hands, the temperature of the air. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. 1 thing you can taste. Anxiety almost always lives in an imagined future. This drags your attention back into a present moment your senses can actually verify. There's one more layer worth adding here, and it comes from a martial arts instructor named Baptiste, who trains competitive fencers outside Marseille. He tells every new student the same thing on their first day. Your opponent cannot see your breath, but your body always shows it. Control the breath, and the fencer with the calmer breath usually wins the exchange, even against a faster blade. He has his students practice a version of the box breathing pattern not during matches, but during the most boring parts of training, while stretching, while waiting between drills. Precisely so, the technique is already boring and automatic by the time a real bout gets tense. Boring, in his gym, is the whole point. A tool you've only ever used in an emergency is a tool you'll fumble in an emergency. A tool you've used 1,000 times on an ordinary afternoon is one your hands can find in the dark. Here's the part people skip, and it's the part that actually matters. These tools are useless if you only remember them exist. Their power comes from repetition, practiced when you're calm, so the pathway is already carved by the time you need it in a storm. You don't wait for the fire to learn where the exits are. You walk the building now on an ordinary Tuesday, so your feet already know the way when the smoke comes. Chapter 4. You are not the weather passing through you. There is a difference between having a feeling and becoming that feeling completely. And almost nobody is ever taught the distinction exists. Most people experience every hard emotion as a total event. When grief shows up, they don't observe grief. They are grief, no daylight between the feeling and the self. When fear arrives, they don't notice fear. They become fear, and it drives the car while the person who's supposed to be in charge watches helplessly from the passenger seat. The skill in this chapter might be the single most transformative one in this entire book. Learning to create a small, deliberate distance between yourself and whatever you're feeling. Becoming the one who observes the weather instead of the one who is the weather. To be clear, this is not suppression. Shoving feelings down and pretending they don't exist is one of the most damaging habits a person can build, linked consistently to worse anxiety, worse physical health, worse relationships. What we're building instead is something more sophisticated, feeling the full weight of an emotion while keeping just enough of an observer's seat that the emotion doesn't get to make every decision for you. There's a technique used in some of the most well-researched modern therapy models, and it's disarmingly simple. It's called linguistic distancing, and it works through nothing more than changing your sentence structure. Instead of saying, "I am overwhelmed," you say, "I notice I'm having the experience of overwhelm." Instead of, "I am terrified," you say, "I notice my mind is generating fear right now." It sounds almost too small to matter. It isn't. That tiny shift in language creates real separation between the stable, continuous you who is watching and the passing content of what you're experiencing. Brain research backs this up directly. Simply naming an emotion out loud measurably calms activity in the amygdala and increases activity in the more reflective, reasoning parts of the brain. Naming creates distance. Distance creates choice. This isn't a metaphor. It's observable biology. It sounds almost too small to matter. It isn't. That tiny shift in language creates real separation between the stable, continuous you who is watching and the passing content of what you're experiencing. Brain research backs this up directly, and simply naming an emotion out loud measurably calms activity in the amygdala and increases activity in the more reflective, reasoning parts of the brain. Naming creates distance. Distance creates choice. This isn't a metaphor. It's observable biology. There's a reason this particular technique works so reliably even for people who feel skeptical of anything resembling self-help language. It doesn't ask you to believe anything or feel differently. It asks you to describe accurately, and accuracy itself does the work. "I am anxious" collapses you and the anxiety into a single fused statement of identity. "I notice anxiety showing up" is simply a more precise description of what's actually occurring. There is a noticer, and there is a thing being noticed, and those genuinely are two different things happening in you right now, whether or not it feels that way in the moment. A man named Raphael, a paramedic in Lisbon who spent 15 years responding to the worst nights of strangers' lives, told me once that the job taught him something most people never learn until much later. You cannot hold the patient's hand and shake at the same time. You feel everything. You just cannot let the feeling drive. That's the whole chapter in one sentence. It's worth being honest about why this is so hard to practice in the moment. Emotions arrive with a kind of built-in urgency. They insist they need to be acted on right now, that any pause is dangerous, that distance is the same as denial. This urgency is itself part of the amygdala's alarm system, the same one from Chapter 2, and learning to recognize the urgency itself as a signal rather than a command is most of the work. The feeling saying, "act now or something terrible will happen," is rarely telling you the truth about the actual time pressure of the situation. It's telling you how alarmed your nervous system currently is. Those are two very different pieces of information, and confusing them is where most regrettable decisions under emotional pressure actually come from. There's a fuller framework worth carrying with you, and it moves in 4 steps. First, recognize what's actually happening. Name it honestly. I am feeling grief. I am feeling rage. Second, allow it. Stop fighting the feeling or arguing yourself out of it, and just let it be present without feeding it. Resistance is what amplifies a feeling. Allowing it without acting on it is what starts to soften it. Third, investigate with real curiosity instead of judgment. Where do you feel this in your body? What does it need? Fourth, respond to yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a close friend going through exactly what you're going through. And there's a final tool here that's almost embarrassingly underused: writing it down, not for anyone else, just for you, unfiltered, for 15 honest minutes. Studies on expressive writing show it lowers stress hormones, improves immune function, and produces measurable relief that lasts for weeks. The mechanism is simple. When you write what's swirling inside you, you give it a shape, a boundary, a location outside your own head. And once it's outside, you can actually look at it instead of being trapped inside it. Picture standing on a riverbank instead of standing in the river. The water is still moving, still cold, still real. You can feel the spray on your face and hear the current, but you're not being swept downstream by it. You're standing beside it, watching it pass, choosing where to walk next, while the river does what rivers do. That's the entire posture this chapter is asking you to build. Not a dam, not a wall pretending the river isn't there, just solid ground under your own feet, close enough to feel everything and far enough not to drown in it. A school teacher named Marisol, teaching in a small mountain town outside Medellin, described using this exact image with her students after a difficult year in the community. She'd ask them, when something upset them badly during the day, to picture themselves stepping from the river onto the bank, not to make the feeling disappear, but to give themselves somewhere solid to stand while it moved through. She said the younger students picked it up faster than most adults do, because they hadn't yet been taught to confuse having a feeling with being swallowed by one. The goal was never to feel less. It's to feel fully while keeping your hands on the wheel. Emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're information. They tell you what matters, what's been violated, what you need. The person who can sit with grief without becoming grief, who can feel fear without being ruled by it, isn't emotionally numb. That person is free. Chapter 5. The person you are. When everything you built falls away. Here is one of the most quietly devastating things that happens when life collapses. People lose themselves, not in some poetic sense, literally. The self they understood themselves to be, defined by the role they played, the title they held, the relationship they were in, the future they were building toward, simply stops existing. A business fails, and the founder no longer knows who they are without it. A marriage ends, and the partner doesn't recognize their own reflection. A diagnosis lands, and the healthy, capable person they always believed themselves to be evaporates overnight. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when identity is built on circumstances instead of character. And it's one of the most common, most fragile ways human beings construct a sense of self. Because everything you can point to, what you have, what you do, what people think of you, can be taken. And when it's taken, whatever self you built on top of it has nothing left underneath it. There's a woman named Consuela, a former opera singer in Buenos Aires, who lost her voice permanently to a vocal cord condition in her 40s, the one thing her entire identity had been built around since childhood. She told me the lowest point wasn't losing the ability to sing. It was the terrifying blank space where "who am I" used to have an easy answer. What eventually pulled her back wasn't a new career or a medical fix. It was a question she forced herself to sit with, one she'd never actually answered before. Who am I when I strip away everything that can be taken from me? Not what she did, not what she had, what she stood for, how she treated people, what she refused to compromise on, even on her worst day with nothing to show for it. Psychologists call this values-based living, and it draws a sharp line between two very different things: goals and values. A goal is an outcome. You either hit it or you don't. A value is a direction, a quality of being you can embody regardless of your circumstances. You can value courage while terrified. You can value kindness while being treated unkindly. And because values, unlike goals, can't be blocked by outside events, an identity rooted in values is structurally immune to the kind of collapse an identity built on circumstances will always be vulnerable to. This has enormous practical weight. If your identity is successful singer, and the voice goes, you lose yourself along with it. If your identity is a person who creates beauty, who shows up fully, who keeps growing, and the voice goes, you lose something painful, genuinely painful. But you don't lose you, because none of that was ever built on the voice in the first place. Consuela eventually became a vocal coach, pouring everything she knew into other singers' voices instead of her own. The crisis didn't destroy her identity, it clarified it. It's worth naming a trap that catches a lot of ambitious, driven people specifically, because it's easy to mistake a values-based identity for one still quietly built on circumstance. Someone might say their core value is excellence, but if what they actually mean is being seen as excellent by others, that's still an external foundation wearing an internal sounding word. A genuine value doesn't require an audience or a scoreboard. It's just as real, just as fully expressed in a version of your life nobody else ever finds out about. A useful test. Would you still consider this a core value if you knew with total certainty that no one would ever know whether you lived it or not? If the honest answer is no, it was never quite the foundation it looked like. This distinction matters more than it might seem, because a values-based identity that's secretly performance-based collapses in exactly the same way a circumstance-based identity does. The moment the audience stops noticing or notices the wrong thing, the whole structure wobbles. The real test of a value isn't whether you can articulate it well, it's whether it survives completely unwitnessed on a day when nobody is grading you, when the only person who will ever know whether you kept your word to yourself is you. Psychological flexibility is the technical name for this, the ability to stay in contact with your values and keep moving in their direction even while carrying painful thoughts and unwanted circumstances. It's not about feeling less. Research shows flexible people feel just as much as anyone else. They just maintain a stronger relationship with their values than with their current emotional weather, which means they can act from their deepest self even while that self is hurting. Building this starts with honesty. Sit down without rushing and ask yourself plainly, who am I when everything that can be taken is gone? Not your job title, not your relationship status, not your bank balance. What kind of person are you committed to being on your hardest day with the least to show for it. Write it down, not as a performance for anyone else, but as a private agreement with yourself. Think of identity like a house. Most people build theirs on a foundation poured out of external material, a title, a relationship, a bank balance, a reputation, because that material is available immediately and it feels solid while the market's good. But that foundation was always borrowed ground, not owned ground, and borrowed ground can be reclaimed by anyone who granted it, an employer, a partner, an economy, a diagnosis. A values-based identity is different. It's poured from material nobody else has a claim on. Nobody can repossess your integrity. Nobody can foreclose on your commitment to showing up honestly. That foundation might still crack under enough pressure. Nothing is indestructible, but it cracks slowly, and it's yours to repair, because you own the ground it's sitting on. This doesn't mean titles, relationships, and achievements don't matter. Of course they matter. They're the rooms you build on top of the foundation, and a house needs rooms to actually live in. The mistake isn't wanting a good career or a strong marriage or a solid reputation. The mistake is quietly, unknowingly, pouring your foundation out of the very same material as your rooms, so that when a room collapses, the whole structure goes down with it. Because foundations matter most when everything built on top of them is shaken. And when your foundation is genuinely yours, chosen deliberately, tested through real experience, you discover something remarkable. The chaos outside you stops being able to manufacture chaos inside you, not because life gets easier, because you finally know with a certainty circumstances can't touch exactly who you are. Chapter 6, Letting Go, is not the same as giving up. There's a truth at the center of human psychology that most people spend their whole lives fighting, and the fighting itself is what keeps them stuck. The harder you resist what's already happened, the more power it has over you. This is the acceptance paradox, and it trips up nearly everyone the first time they hear it, because the word acceptance gets confused with surrender. It has nothing to do with approving of what happened, or pretending it's fine, or giving up on wanting things to change. Acceptance means something much narrower and much more useful. Acknowledging, without resistance, that what has already happened, that what currently exists. Full stop. That distinction changes everything, because you can fully accept a reality and simultaneously work with everything you've got to change it. What you can't do, what nobody can do and stay psychologically intact, is effectively deal with a reality you're still busy refusing to admit is real. There's a useful line drawn between pain and suffering here. Pain is the direct, honest response to something difficult. Grief over a loss, fear of uncertainty, the ache of failure. Pain is mostly unavoidable. It's just what a conscious being feels in a world that doesn't always cooperate. Suffering is what gets added on top when we tell ourselves the pain shouldn't be happening, that it's unbearable, that life has personally betrayed us. Suffering is pain multiplied by resistance, and while you can't always control the pain, you have far more say over the suffering than most people ever realize. A man named Duncan, who ran a small dairy farm in the Scottish Highlands for 30 years, lost nearly his entire herd to disease in a single terrible season. He told me the turning point wasn't some grand realization. It was the morning he stopped waking up, rehearsing the argument with what had already happened. "I kept fighting with a fact," he said. You cannot win a fight with a fact. It's already won before you started. The day he stopped fighting, it wasn't the day the grief ended. It was the day the extra suffering ended, and what was left was something he could actually work with. Studies on acceptance-based approaches consistently show people who learn to stop fighting difficult internal experiences, thoughts, memories, physical sensations, report lower overall distress and significantly greater resilience going forward, not because their circumstances improved, but because they stopped pouring energy into a battle they could never win. There's a common misunderstanding worth clearing up directly, because it stops a lot of people from ever trying this in the first place. Acceptance is not a single event after which the difficulty is permanently resolved. For anything genuinely significant, acceptance is closer to a practice you return to again and again, sometimes several times in a single day, especially in the early weeks. You accept it in the morning, and by afternoon you notice yourself arguing with it again, and you accept it again. This isn't failure or backsliding. It's simply how a mind this deeply attached to a different outcome gradually, unevenly, makes peace with the one that actually happened. Genuine acceptance doesn't feel like relief right away. It often feels like grief, because accepting what's real means letting go of the version of the story you'd been quietly insisting on, the one where things worked out the way you'd planned. You grieve the plan that didn't happen, and on the other side of that grief is something remarkable: clarity. The mental energy that had been locked up in resistance becomes available again for thinking, for choosing, for acting. There's a relational side to this too, worth naming honestly. When you stop fighting your own reality, you stop needing everyone around you to validate the fight, to keep agreeing it was unfair, to keep confirming you deserve to be devastated. That need, understandable as it is, quietly wears down relationships over time, because it asks the people who love you to stay stuck in the pain right alongside you. Letting go frees not just you, but them too. Think of it like carrying a bag of wet sand up a hill. The moment you stop resisting the truth that the bag is heavy, the moment you stop pretending it's light, stop arguing with the weight, you can actually adjust your grip, change your pace, ask for help carrying it. But as long as you're spending your strength insisting the bag shouldn't be this heavy, you have nothing left over for the actual climb. The weight doesn't change either way. Only your ability to move with it does. A woman named Farah, a midwife working in a busy maternity ward in Amman, once put it this way: after a particularly brutal shift that ended in a loss she couldn't have prevented, "I used to think accepting something meant I had stopped caring about it. It's the opposite. I only had room to care properly once I stopped fighting the fact of it." Her nights got no easier after that realization, but her mornings did, because she wasn't spending them refighting a battle from the night before that had already been decided. It's worth distinguishing acceptance clearly from resignation, because from a distance they can look almost identical, and confusing them keeps a lot of people from ever attempting acceptance at all. Resignation says the future is fixed too, that because this happened, nothing better is coming, so there's no point trying. Acceptance says only the past is fixed. What already happened cannot be changed by any amount of fighting. What happens next is still entirely open and still entirely worth your full effort. Duncan didn't accept the loss of his herd and then give up farming. He accepted the loss, grieved it honestly, and then rebuilt with everything he had, because acceptance had freed the energy resignation would have simply extinguished. Letting go was never weakness. It's the decision of someone who's realized their energy is too valuable to keep spending on a battle that's already over and is saving it instead for the ones that are still winnable. Chapter 7. Teaching your brain a new default. Your brain, as it exists right now, has a bias, not a moral one, a wiring one. It's called the negativity bias, and it's not a character flaw. It's an inheritance from ancestors who survived by noticing danger faster than safety, remembering pain more vividly than pleasure, scanning constantly for what could go wrong. That brain kept your ancestors alive. But the world has changed far faster than the hardware has. And now that same threat detection system fires at an email that reads a little cold, a conversation that felt tense, a 2 a.m. worry about the future, with the exact same alarm architecture it would use for an actual predator. The result is a nervous system stuck in a low chronic hum of alert, a baseline that sits much closer to anxiety than to peace. Not because life is genuinely dangerous most of the time, but because the brain hasn't yet learned to sort real emergencies from ordinary difficulty. The good news, backed by decades of research, this bias is a default setting, not a permanent one, and defaults can be changed with deliberate, repeated practice. The first mechanism worth understanding is rumination, replaying a problem over and over as if enough repetition might solve it. It feels productive. It feels like problem solving. But research consistently shows rumination doesn't generate solutions. It just keeps your nervous system in sustained alarm and strengthens the very neural pathways tied to negative thinking. The more you rehearse the worry, the better your brain gets at worrying. The antidote isn't forced positivity, insisting everything's fine when it clearly isn't. It's something more honest, called reappraisal, deliberately looking for an interpretation that's equally true but less catastrophic. A young architect named Bilal, working in Dubai, got blistering feedback on a project he'd poured himself into. His first read was simple: "I'm failing, and everyone's about to see it." Reappraisal asked a second question: "Could this also mean my supervisor thinks I'm capable of more and is pushing accordingly?" Both interpretations fit the same facts. Only one of them kept him stuck in dread. The goal was never to deny the difficulty. It was to widen the lens beyond the most frightening possible read. It's worth noting that reappraisal is not the same as denial, and the difference matters enormously. Denial says, "This isn't really a problem." Reappraisal says, "This is a real problem, and here is a fuller, more accurate range of what it might mean." Including possibilities the panicked mind conveniently leaves out. The distorted version of events isn't wrong because it's negative. It's wrong because it's incomplete, treating the single most frightening interpretation as if it were the only one the facts could support. The second mechanism is avoidance. When something triggers anxiety, a hard conversation, an overwhelming task, the instinct is to dodge it, and dodging brings instant relief. But every time you avoid something, you teach your brain it really was too dangerous to face, and the avoided thing grows larger in your mind while you grow smaller in relation to it. The fix is graduated exposure, deliberately, progressively facing the thing in small enough doses that your nervous system gets direct evidence it can actually handle it. Not that it's pleasant, that it's survivable. Repeated enough times, the alarm quiets, and what once triggered panic becomes something you can face steadily. Not because it changed, but because you did. Graduated exposure works best when it's actually graduated, which is a step people frequently skip in their eagerness to just get the dreaded thing over with. If a difficult phone call feels overwhelming, the latter might start with simply writing down what you'd say, then saying it out loud alone in a room, then rehearsing it with a trusted friend, and only then making the actual call. Each rung gives your nervous system a smaller, more survivable dose of the same fear, building real evidence of capability one step at a time, rather than the all-or-nothing leap that so often ends in avoidance winning again. The third mechanism is your body itself. Chronic muscle tension, shallow breathing, and poor sleep all send your brain physiological signals that read as danger, which raises its threat sensitivity even further. This loop runs both directions. Mind shapes body, body shapes mind, which means training your body is not separate from training your mind. Regular movement has been shown repeatedly to lower amygdala reactivity and raise prefrontal activity. Real sleep, 7 to 9 hours, isn't a luxury, it's maintenance for the exact system you're trying to regulate. Research shows sleep-deprived brains show dramatically higher threat reactivity than well-rested ones. There's a fourth piece worth naming because it quietly undermines the other three if left unchecked. The habit of scanning for threat, even during genuinely good moments, waiting for the other shoe to drop. A restaurant owner named Cormac, running a small pub outside Galway that had barely survived years of financial strain, told me that even after the business finally stabilized, he caught himself bracing every time the phone rang, certain it was bad news. He had to consciously practice letting good news be good news without immediately searching it for a hidden catch. That's a skill, too, receiving safety without suspicion, and it needs practicing just as deliberately as the others. Or the nervous system keeps hunting for danger even in rooms where none exists. Rewiring this response isn't a weekend project. It's a long, quiet campaign of small, daily choices. Reappraising instead of catastrophizing, approaching instead of avoiding, moving your body, resting it properly, practicing the breathing tools from Chapter 3 until they're instinctive. None of these choices just change your behavior in the moment. Over time, they change your baseline. And a different baseline changes everything that gets built on top of it. Chapter 8. The narrator inside you is not a neutral reporter. There is a voice inside your head, and it has been narrating your entire life. It tells you what events mean, what people think of you, what the future holds. It connects the dots between your past and your present and projects them forward into predictions about what's coming next. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. That narrator is not reporting reality. It's constructing it. Two people can go through the exact same job loss and walk away with entirely different stories. One tells themselves, "This proves I'm not good enough, and good things never last for me." The other tells themselves, "This is painful and unexpected, and I'll need to find a different path." I've found different paths before. Same facts, radically different narratives. And those different narratives produce radically different feelings, decisions, and outcomes. The story isn't a reflection of reality. The story shapes reality. This is the foundational idea behind one of the most rigorously tested forms of psychological treatment ever developed. It's not events themselves that produce your emotional and behavioral response. It's your interpretation of them. Ancient philosophy said essentially the same thing long before any lab existed. It's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. Under real pressure, your inner narrator doesn't become more accurate. It becomes more extreme. It reaches for the most dramatic version available. A setback becomes, I am a failure. A conflict becomes, I am unlovable. A scare becomes, everything is falling apart. These distorted stories feel like clear-eyed truth while you're inside them. They are not truths. They are stories. And stories can be rewritten. A woman named Priyanka, running a small textile export business out of Jaipur, watched a key client cancel a contract that represented a third of her yearly revenue. Her mind's first draft was brutal. I've ruined everything. I was never cut out for this. She caught herself, though, because she'd practiced catching herself before. She asked one simple question. Is this the only story that fits the facts? And she found another one, just as true. This is a serious loss, and I have rebuilt from serious losses before. Neither story denied the difficulty. Only one of them left room for her to keep functioning. The most dangerous stories are rarely the ones you say out loud. They're the background scripts running so quietly you don't even recognize them as stories. I'm not the kind of person who can handle this. Every time something good happens, it gets taken away. I always end up alone. These operate like filters. And because the mind is remarkably good at finding evidence for whatever it already believes, these background stories confirm themselves over and over, feeding on every new experience that gets pushed through the filter. This is where confirmation bias quietly does its damage. If your background story insists you always end up alone, your mind will vividly remember every night spent isolated and barely register the dozens of moments of real connection that don't fit the script. This isn't dishonesty on your part. It's simply how attention behaves once it's been trained by a story for years. It's exactly why saying these background stories out loud to someone else matters so much. A story that only ever plays silently in your own head never has to survive contact with anyone else's honest perspective on the same events. The practice starts with one deceptively simple question. Is this story actually true? Not does it feel true, but is it factually, demonstrably true? And even if some version of it is true, is it the only story that fits? Is there another interpretation equally consistent with the facts that's less catastrophic and less limiting? The strongest reframes were never the ones that denied difficulty. Those collapse the moment reality pushes back. They're the ones that hold the hard truth and your own capacity for handling it at the same time. This is genuinely hard, and I have gotten through hard things before. I don't know how this resolves, and I have figured out difficult situations in the past. These aren't wishful thinking. They're more complete than the catastrophic version because they include the part of the evidence the catastrophic story always leaves out: your own history of enduring. It helps to picture the narrator as a separate character sitting just behind your shoulder, narrating events into your ear in real time, because that's closer to what's actually happening than it feels like from the inside. Once you can picture the narrator as a voice rather than the truth, you can start asking it questions instead of automatically obeying it. What's the evidence for this version? What would I tell a friend who described this exact situation to me? Is there a kinder narrator available who's just as honest? A journalist named Ottavia, covering difficult stories out of Naples for over a decade, described developing something she called an editor's ear for her own inner narration, the same instinct she used to cut an overwrought line from a news piece, turned inward. When her mind offered her a sentence like, "Nothing ever works out for me," she learned to hear it the way she'd hear a lazy, unsupported claim in someone else's draft. And she'd send it back for revision. What specifically didn't work out, and what's actually true about the rest of my life right now? The story got smaller, more accurate, and far less crushing every time she edited it that way. The story you tell yourself right now is shaping your experience of this moment far more than the bare facts of the situation ever will. Which means rewriting it isn't a soft exercise in positive thinking. It's one of the most concrete, consequential moves available to you. Chapter 9. The quiet advantage of the calmest person in the room. In any charged situation, a negotiation, an argument, a crisis, there's an invisible dynamic running underneath the visible one. The visible dynamic is whatever's happening on the surface. The invisible one is about who is governing their own internal state most effectively, and in that hidden contest, the calmest person almost always wins. Not the most knowledgeable, not the most senior, the calmest. Think about the people you've most admired under real pressure. The surgeon whose hand stays steady when a life is on the table. The negotiator who stays measured while the other side escalates. The parent whose voice doesn't crack when the house is chaos. What you're seeing isn't the absence of feeling. They feel everything, often more than the people visibly panicking. What you're seeing is retained access to their own clarity even while under fire. That retained access is the practical meaning of stillness. Stillness isn't inactivity, it's the internal ground that makes good action possible. Someone whose emotional state is driven entirely by whatever just happened is perpetually off balance, always reacting to the last thing, making every decision from a place of disruption. Someone who's built even a small pocket of internal quiet operates from ground. And from ground, decisions get sharper. Communication gets clearer. Presence gets more stabilizing to everyone around them. There's a distinction worth drawing here between stillness and detachment, because the two are easy to confuse from the outside. Detachment is checking out, going numb, disengaging from what actually matters, because engaging feels too costly. Stillness is the opposite, staying fully engaged with the difficulty while declining to let it hijack your nervous system. A surgeon who is still is not indifferent to the outcome on the table. She may care more than anyone else in the room. Her stillness is precisely what allows that care to translate into steady hands rather than a trembling one. Research on decision-making under stress is consistent. When the nervous system is flooded, judgment deteriorates in predictable ways. People become more reckless where caution is needed and more paralyzed where boldness is needed. Attention narrows onto immediate threats, and long-term consequences fall out of view. This isn't a character flaw in stressed people. It's what a human brain does in survival mode. It trades wisdom for speed. Stillness is the deliberate practice of not going into survival mode when survival mode isn't actually required. And it's built almost entirely through unglamorous daily practice, the kind most productivity culture actively discourages. A retired air traffic controller named Solveig, who spent 26 years directing planes through Reykjavik's brutal winter storms, told me something that stuck. The job trained me to be still on purpose, every single ordinary shift, so that the one bad shift never had to be the first time I tried it. Her ritual was simple and unglamorous. 20 minutes of silence with a coffee before her shift began, phone in another room, no input, no noise, nothing to perform, just quiet. That kind of deliberate silence, not the absence of sound, but the cultivation of mental quiet, is one of the most powerful and most culturally undervalued practices available. Modern life treats stillness as wasted time. Being quiet gets read as having nothing to say. And that quiet contempt for stillness is a big part of why so many people feel perpetually behind, perpetually reactive, unable to think clearly even when nothing is actively wrong. Think of your nervous system like a lake, thrown into constant motion, waves from every direction, boats crossing at all hours. A lake can't reflect anything clearly, no matter how bright the sky above it is. The same water, given 20 undisturbed minutes, becomes a mirror. Nothing about the lake changed, except the disturbance stopped. Your mind works the same way. The insight, the clarity, the good decision were often already available to you. They just couldn't surface through all the churn. Stillness doesn't manufacture wisdom from nothing. It removes the disturbance that was hiding wisdom you already had. Even 10 to 20 minutes a day of focused, intentional quiet has been documented across dozens of studies to lower baseline anxiety, sharpen emotional regulation, and strengthen the brain's ability to keep its wiser regions in charge during high-pressure moments. And it doesn't have to be formal meditation. A walk without a phone, tea actually tasted instead of gulped, a drive in silence, writing with no agenda. All of it trains the same muscle, being fully present with one moment, without resistance, without an agenda. There's a social dimension to this worth naming, too. Calm is contagious. Your nervous system reads other people's states constantly, through tone, posture, pace. And when you walk into chaos carrying genuine stillness, not performed composure, the people around you feel it, and their own systems start to settle in response. This is the real mechanism behind every great leader, therapist, or parent who can lower the temperature of a room just by being in it. That capacity isn't built in the crisis. It's built in the ordinary Tuesday, long before anyone needed you to be steady. It's worth adding that this contagion cuts both ways, which is a sobering thought worth sitting with. If calm spreads from a regulated nervous system to the people around it, panic spreads just as readily from a dysregulated one. A parent who walks into the house already flooded with the day's stress, voice sharp before anyone said a word, isn't just having a bad moment privately. They're quietly transmitting that state to everyone nearby, whether they mean to or not. This isn't a reason for guilt. It's simply useful information. Your own regulation is not a purely private matter. It's something the people closest to you are absorbing constantly, which makes the daily, unglamorous work of building your own stillness one of the more generous things you can do for the people you love, even on days when nothing is visibly wrong. Chapter 10. Stop living inside the disaster that hasn't happened yet. Here's where most of your suffering actually lives. Not in what's happening right now, but in a future that doesn't exist yet. The conversation that might go badly, the diagnosis that might be worse, the money that might run out. Your mind fills the uncertainty of the present with the worst-case version of tomorrow, and then it makes you live there, feeling the full emotional weight of a catastrophe that hasn't happened and may never happen, while the actual moment in front of you goes completely unwitnessed. This loop disguises itself as responsibility. It tells you that worrying enough is a form of preparation, that thinking through the worst case will somehow protect you from it. But research on worry is blunt about this. It doesn't improve your preparation for what's actually coming. It doesn't generate better solutions. What it reliably does is consume the only moment where you ever actually have power, right now, in service of a future your worry has no ability to control. A man named Emeka, a civil engineer overseeing a bridge project outside Enugu, once described the months before a major inspection as the worst stretch of his adult life. Not because the work was going badly, but because his mind ran the worst-case collapse scenario on a loop every single night. What eventually pulled him out wasn't fixing the bridge. The bridge was already fine. It was a habit he built of catching the spiral and asking one question: what is actually true right now, in this room, in this breath? Not what might be true in 3 months. What's true now? 9 times out of 10, right now was fine. It's worth being precise about the difference between worry and genuine preparation, because collapsing the two is exactly what keeps the loop running. Preparation has an endpoint. You make the checklist, you rehearse the conversation once, you set aside the emergency fund, and then you stop, because the useful work is done. Worry has no endpoint. It replays the same scenario without ever producing a new action, because its real function was never to solve anything. It was to give the nervous system something to do with its own alarm. Once you notice a worry has already generated its one useful insight and is now just looping for the 10th time with nothing new to offer, that's the signal to consciously set it down, not evidence that you haven't worried hard enough yet. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for clear thinking, wise decisions, real connection, functions best in the present. When your attention gets pulled into rehearsing disasters that haven't happened, you're not fully here, and you're not in full possession of your best cognitive resources. You end up responding to a future threat while only half present for the actual moment that's asking something of you. The discipline of presence is simply the repeated, deliberate return of your attention to what's actually happening, not to ignore the future. Real planning matters, but to refuse letting an imagined future colonize your actual, lived experience of today. It has 3 parts: choosing on purpose where your attention goes, staying anchored to what's here rather than what might come, and doing it without adding a layer of self-criticism when your mind inevitably wanders, because it will many times a day. A useful practical habit here is what some therapists call a scheduled worry window, a specific, bounded time each day, perhaps 15 minutes in the early evening, set aside deliberately for worrying. When a worry surfaces outside that window, rather than either suppressing it or following it down the spiral, you simply note it briefly and tell yourself honestly that it will get its full attention later at the scheduled time. Most people who try this notice something surprising. By the time the window arrives, a large share of the day's worries have either resolved themselves or lost most of their charge simply from not being fed all day. The mind, it turns out, doesn't need worry available at every moment to feel like it's taking things seriously. It just needs to know worry has a place to go. There's a well-known idea from a man who survived unimaginable loss and still insisted that between whatever happens to you and how you respond to it, there's a space. And in that space lies your freedom. That space is the present moment. It's the only place your choices are actually made. The future is a thought. The past is a memory. The only thing that's real is now. There's a useful way to picture the difference between planning and spiraling, because from the inside they can feel deceptively similar. Planning is stepping out onto a bridge for a moment to look ahead, gathering what you need to see, and then stepping back onto solid ground to actually walk. Spiraling is standing permanently on that bridge, staring into fog, refusing to come back to the ground you're actually standing on, convinced that if you just keep staring hard enough, the fog will finally clear. It never does from there. It only clears once you're close enough to the moment itself to see it plainly, which means coming back to the ground first. Every time you feel your mind starting to spiral and you gently, firmly bring it back to what's actually in front of you, you're not just managing anxiety in the moment. You're weakening the automatic pathway from uncertainty to catastrophe and strengthening the one from uncertainty to grounded clarity. Practiced consistently, this doesn't erase uncertainty from your life. Nothing can. But it erases the habit of suffering in advance for something that may never arrive, and it hands back to you the only time you ever actually have. Chapter 11. Small Anchors That Hold You Together. Anyone who's lived through a genuinely difficult, disorienting stretch of time knows this feeling, the sense of drifting, of not knowing what to hold on to from one day to the next. The job's gone, or the relationship's over, or the future you'd mapped out has been erased, and there's nothing familiar left to orient around. What steadies people through that drift is not willpower, it's not optimism, it's practice. Small, daily, embodied rituals that build reliable islands of stability inside an otherwise unstable stretch of life. An emotional anchor is any practice you engage in consistently enough that it reliably returns you to a grounded state. The distinction that matters here is consistency. A technique you try for the first time while already in full panic has almost no power because your nervous system has no established link between the practice and safety. A technique you've been doing every morning for 6 months, by contrast, has been paired with calm so many times that simply beginning, it starts pulling you toward ground before you've even finished. A man named Tobias, a widower raising 2 teenagers alone in a small town outside Munich, told me the thing that got him through the first brutal year wasn't therapy, though therapy helped. And it wasn't time, though time helped too. It was a 5-minute ritual he never skipped, making 1 pot of coffee by hand every morning, slowly, deliberately, before looking at his phone. It wasn't about the coffee, he said. It was proof every single morning that I could still do one small thing on purpose, even on the worst days. The strongest anchors share a few traits. They're physical, involving the body, not just the mind, because emotion actually lives in the body, and regulation that skips the body is always incomplete. They're consistent, happening at roughly the same time in roughly the same way until they stop requiring effort. They're short enough to survive chaos, An anchor requiring an hour of uninterrupted time will die exactly during the periods it's most needed. And they're honest. They don't require you to feel better before you start. They just require you to show up. Mornings carry outsized leverage here. What you do in the first half hour of your day sets the tone for everything after it. A morning that opens with news, notifications, and other people's demands before your nervous system has had a chance to settle from sleep is a morning that starts in reactivity. A morning that opens with even a few minutes of intentional quiet, deliberate breathing, a short walk, a page of handwriting, a slowly tasted cup of something warm, starts from ground, and the rest of the day is subtly different because of it. Movement deserves particular mention not as performance exercise, but as regulation. Research on walking in natural settings shows measurable reductions in rumination and lowered activity in the brain regions tied to negative self-focused thinking. You don't need to train for a marathon. You need to move your body deliberately and let it do what it was built to do. It's worth saying plainly that the specific anchor matters far less than the consistency of it. People sometimes spend months searching for the right morning ritual, trying meditation apps and journaling templates and elaborate routines, when the actual mechanism doesn't care whether the anchor is sophisticated. It cares whether it's repeated. A 5-minute walk done daily for a year will do more for your nervous system than an elaborate hour-long routine attempted twice and abandoned. Pick something small enough that missing a day of everything else in your life still leaves room for it, and let repetition, not ambition, do the real work. Closing rituals matter just as much as opening ones, a deliberate signal to your nervous system that a period of difficulty has ended for the day and it's safe to rest. Without that signal, your body will keep running the stress response long after the actual stressor has passed. A few minutes, writing down what you handled today, what you're grateful for, and what you'll leave for tomorrow, teaches your system that today has a boundary and tonight is for recovery. Gratitude practice belongs here too, and not as a slogan. Research shows people who regularly write down specific things they're grateful for report measurably higher well-being and life satisfaction than those who don't. Not because it denies difficulty, but because it deliberately redirects attention toward what's present and working, alongside whatever is genuinely hard. Attention shapes the pathways that govern emotional tone, and consistently pointing it at what's good, even in small amounts, gradually shifts the brain's default setting. Picture a small fishing boat caught in open water during a storm. What keeps that boat from being smashed against the rocks isn't the size of the engine or the courage of the crew alone. It's the anchor, dropped long before the storm arrived, holding a fixed point the boat can return to no matter how hard the waves are working against it. The anchor doesn't stop the storm. It just gives the boat something solid to hold against while the storm does what storms do, until it passes, as storms eventually do. The deepest function of these anchors isn't regulation in the moment, it's identity, reinforced one repetition at a time. Every time you show up for your practice, especially on the days you don't feel like it, you're telling yourself something quiet and important. I am the kind of person who doesn't abandon myself when things get hard. Repeated across hundreds of ordinary mornings, that message becomes the deepest anchor of all. Chapter 12. Staying close to people. When everything in you wants to disappear, something happens to people under sustained pressure that almost nobody talks about, and it does real damage. They vanish, not physically, emotionally. They pull inward, stop reaching out, go quiet with exactly the people they need most. This isn't a mystery, it's biology. The same threat response that prepares your body to fight or flee also, in social situations, prepares it to withdraw. Connection requires vulnerability, and to a nervous system on high alert, vulnerability feels dangerous. It costs energy a depleted system doesn't feel it has, and it risks rejection at the exact moment rejection feels unbearable. So the walls go up, and the person who needed connection most ends up alone in a room full of people who would have shown up. Recognizing this pattern in yourself early matters more than most people realize, because withdrawal has a way of feeling reasonable in the moment even while it's quietly making things worse. A useful early warning sign worth watching for. Notice whether you've started declining invitations you would normally accept, letting messages sit unanswered for days, or telling yourself that people probably don't want to hear about what you're going through anyway. None of these thoughts are usually true in the way they feel true. They're the withdrawal instinct dressed up as consideration for others, and catching that disguise early is often the difference between a hard season handled with support and one handled completely alone. And yet the research on human resilience is unambiguous on this point. Connection isn't a nice supplement to weathering hardship. It's one of its primary biological foundations. Long-running studies following people across entire lifetimes have found that the single most consistent predictor of who stayed healthy, sharp, and genuinely well through decades of difficulty wasn't wealth, intelligence, or career success. It was the quality of their close relationships. There's a neurological reason for this. Human nervous systems co-regulate with each other in ways solo self-regulation can't fully replicate. Being in the genuine presence of someone safe, someone your body has learned to associate with warmth and non-judgment, activates your parasympathetic system in a way that mirrors your best breathing practice. Being seen, being held, being near someone who cares produces real measurable shifts in stress hormones and heart rhythm. Connection isn't just emotional comfort, it's physiological medicine. A woman named Ingrid, running a small vineyard in the hills outside Porto after her husband's sudden death left her with the business and 2 young kids, told me the hardest habit to break wasn't grief. It was the instinct to go silent with her closest friends right when she needed them most. Shame told me if they really saw how badly I was drowning, they would see me differently, she said. What actually happened when she finally spoke honestly to one friend was the opposite of what shame predicted. Not judgment, but recognition. Her friend had drowned too once, in her own way. Research on shame confirms this precisely. The antidote isn't more self-protection. It's the courageous act of naming the hard thing to a safe person, which almost always produces empathy instead of the judgment shame swore was coming. That doesn't fix the crisis. But breaking the isolation is, for many people, the single most transformative thing that can happen inside a hard season. There are real skills here worth naming. First, asking for exactly what you need instead of either suffering silently or venting without direction. People who love you want to help. They often just don't know how. Saying plainly, I need you to listen without fixing this right now, or I need practical help with this one thing, gives them a way to actually show up. Second, reciprocity. Staying genuinely curious about the people around you, even while you're struggling, not by performing wellness you don't feel, but by refusing to let your own pain make the relationship entirely one-directional. Even 10 minutes of real curiosity about someone else's life, in the middle of your own hardest chapter, pays enormous dividends in the strength of that relationship. Third, letting people in imperfectly, not waiting until you have the right words or feel composed enough to explain without your voice breaking. The people who love you don't need your polished version. They need you. It's also worth being discerning about who you open up to, because not every relationship is built to hold real weight, and pretending otherwise can leave you feeling more exposed rather than less alone. A safe person is not necessarily the one you've known longest, or the one closest to you by title. It's the one who has, in the past, responded to your honesty with curiosity rather than judgment, who can sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it or minimize it. Noticing who has actually earned that trust rather than assuming it should default to whoever is nearest protects you from the particular pain of vulnerability met with the wrong response. And if the people closest to you genuinely aren't equipped to show up the way you need, a real situation, not a hypothetical one, the answer is to widen the circle deliberately, through therapy, through community, through any space where real connection around real experience is available. Seeing a therapist isn't a last resort for people who are broken. It's the same intelligence that leads someone to see a doctor for a physical illness, recognizing that some kinds of difficulty genuinely need more than ordinary support can give. There's an image worth carrying from this chapter: a single ember, pulled out of the fire and left alone on cold stone, goes dark within minutes, no matter how hot it was a moment ago. Put back among the other embers, even briefly, it catches again. Human beings are built the same way. You were never designed to hold your own heat in total isolation, and the fact that you can't is not a flaw in your design. It's the whole design working exactly as intended. Staying close to the fire, even and especially when withdrawing feels safer, is not a nice extra. It's maintenance for the exact thing you're trying to protect. Chapter 13. What the hardest season can build in you. History is full of people broken by what happened to them, and equally full of people built by it. The difference was never the severity of the suffering. It's the relationship they chose to build with it, the meaning they refused to let it lack, and what they eventually did with everything the difficulty forced them to learn. This isn't a motivational idea. It's a documented psychological phenomenon, studied for decades, showing that a substantial number of people who go through genuinely serious hardship report not just recovery afterward, but real growth, greater personal strength, deeper relationships, a sharper appreciation for life, attributed directly to their encounter with what nearly broke them. This isn't suggesting hardship is secretly good or that suffering should be welcomed. It's documenting that the human mind, under the right conditions, is capable of not just surviving difficulty, but being genuinely enlarged by it. And those conditions are learnable. They're not luck, and they're not a personality type. The first condition is fully processing what happened instead of rushing past it. The instinct, especially in cultures that prize forward momentum, is to move on quickly, get back to normal, not dwell. But pain that isn't processed doesn't vanish. It goes underground, and keep shaping behavior and relationships from below the surface, usually more disruptively than the original experience would have been. Processing means actually sitting with what happened, in honest conversation, in therapy, in unfiltered writing, until it becomes something that happened to you rather than something still invisibly happening. The second condition is meaning-making, the deliberate construction of an honest, complete story about the experience, one that places it inside the larger arc of your life with real purpose. Meaning isn't found sitting inside painful experiences. It's built. The last human freedom, one no external circumstance can touch, is the freedom to choose your attitude toward whatever's happened. Not to approve of it, not to minimize it, but to decide what it points toward and what you'll do with what you now know because of it. This process can't be rushed, and it shouldn't be. Pressuring yourself to find meaning before you've finished grieving just delays the very growth you're trying to force. It's worth being honest about timelines here, because this kind of growth almost never follows a straight, predictable line. Some people find real meaning within months of a serious loss. Others take years, moving through extended stretches of anger and grief before anything resembling growth becomes accessible at all. Neither pace indicates success or failure. The capacity for growth is available to anyone who's genuinely been through something hard. But it can't be forced onto a schedule. And trying to hurry yourself into growing before you finish grieving simply pushes the grieving underground, where it does more damage rather than less. The third condition is putting what you've learned into active use. A man named Jian, who survived a severe depressive episode in his early 30s while running a small tech firm in Taipei, spent the following years building the first mental health support program his industry had ever seen at scale, specifically because he remembered exactly what he'd needed and hadn't had. The pain became capacity. The capacity became something offered to other people. There's a fourth condition, quieter than the rest, locating your experience inside the larger human story instead of treating it as an isolated, uniquely personal catastrophe. Grief, failure, fear, illness, betrayal. These aren't aberrations. They're core features of being human. Every person who has ever lived has faced some version of what you're facing. That recognition doesn't reduce the pain, but it dissolves the isolation, and the isolation was always half the weight. Think of it the way a bone heals after a serious fracture. Nobody would ever wish for the break. But if it's set properly, given real time, and allowed to knit, the bone that grows back across that fracture line is often measurably denser and stronger at exactly that point than the bone around it ever was. That's not a metaphor doctors invented to comfort people. It's simple biology, and it maps almost perfectly onto what happens psychologically when a person processes real hardship honestly instead of rushing past it. The break was real. The pain of the break was real, and the strength that grows back across it, given the right conditions, can be real too. None of this happens automatically, and none of it happens on command. It requires the four conditions we've named: honest processing, deliberate meaning-making, active use of what was learned, and locating your story inside the larger human one, held with patience rather than forced with urgency. This is the actual alchemy, not denial, not performance, not forced positivity. It's the genuinely difficult, genuinely brave work of insisting that what broke you also, eventually, builds something in you that couldn't have existed any other way. Chapter 14. Building a life that doesn't wait for the storm to prepare. Most people treat resilience as something reactive. They wait for hardship to arrive and then scramble to cope. That works, sort of, but it's exhausting because it requires summoning resources you may not have been building during the calm stretches beforehand. It's like trying to start saving money only after the emergency has already landed. Proactive resilience means deliberately building the internal and external architecture of a steady life before you need it, recognizing difficulty as a reliable, recurring feature of any full life, not an aberration, and preparing accordingly. There are a few dimensions worth being deliberate about. The first is physical. Sleep is the single most important recovery mechanism your body has. 7 to 9 hours isn't indulgence. It's maintenance for the exact system you're relying on to stay regulated. Regular movement trains the systems of stress response and recovery directly. None of this is glamorous. All of it is foundational. The second is relational. A resilient life contains a meaningful few relationships that can bear real honesty, not hundreds of shallow connections. These require ongoing investment during the ordinary times. The phone call made just to stay close, the honest conversation chosen over the easier, superficial one. Relationships, like physical fitness, don't hold their strength without maintenance, and people who discover in crisis that they have no one to call usually aren't discovering that nobody cares. They're discovering that the relationships that could have gone deep were kept shallow by years of neglect. The third dimension is financial, not wealth, margin. Financial pressure is one of the most relentless and often invisible sources of psychological strain in modern life. Spending meaningfully less than you earn, keeping reserves that could sustain real disruption, avoiding debt structures that leave no room for the unexpected. This isn't just prudent, it's psychologically protective. A person with 3 months of living expenses set aside experiences a job loss as a serious challenge. A person with nothing set aside experiences the exact same job loss as an existential emergency. The financial shape of your life directly shapes how your nervous system experiences the inevitable disruptions inside it. It's worth being realistic about this dimension for anyone currently living paycheck to paycheck, because just save 3 months of expenses can sound like advice from someone who has never actually struggled financially. The point isn't to reach some specific number overnight. It's to start wherever you actually are. Even a small automatic transfer of a modest amount each payday builds the same psychological effect over time that a larger reserve does, because what changes your nervous system's relationship to financial uncertainty isn't the size of the cushion so much as the presence of any cushion at all. And the proof, growing steadily, that you're someone actively building one. The fourth dimension is purpose, something in your life that matters beyond the immediate and the personal. Research consistently identifies a sense of meaning as one of the strongest predictors of both well-being and resilience, not because purpose prevents pain, but because it gives you a reference point that stays visible even when the immediate landscape is obscured by difficulty. Whatever your purpose is, the work you're building, the people you're raising, the problem you're trying to solve, its presence in your life isn't a luxury reserved for the good times. It's a resource for the hard ones. The fifth dimension is skill, specifically the exact capacities built throughout this book: emotional regulation, honest narrative, physiological self-management, acceptance, presence, identity clarity. These aren't philosophical ideas, they're functional abilities. And like any ability, they're either developed or undeveloped. Someone who's never practiced emotional regulation until it was urgently needed has almost no access to it in the moment of crisis. Someone who's been practicing it imperfectly but genuinely for 2 years has built something that's already there when it's needed, because it was built long before the storm arrived. A woman named Aylin, who runs a small mountain rescue volunteer unit outside Tromsø, described this exact principle from a completely different angle. Her team trains constantly during the calmest months of the year, practicing knots, rehearsing radio protocols, running drills nobody outside the unit ever sees, precisely because the actual rescues happen in blizzards, at night, with adrenaline already flooding everyone's system. Nobody learns a new knot in a storm, she told me. You learn the knot on a warm afternoon in July, so your hands already know it in January. The 5 dimensions in this chapter are your July practice. The storm, whenever it comes, is not the time to start building them. Think of these 5 dimensions like the roots of a large tree standing in open ground. A tree with a shallow root system can look every bit as tall and impressive as one with deep roots, right up until real wind arrives. It's not the branches that determine whether a tree survives a storm. It's what was built underground, invisibly, over years, long before the storm was ever forecast. Nobody claps for root growth. Nobody photographs it. But it's the only part of the tree that actually decides whether it's still standing the next morning. The long game, ultimately, is a decision to take your own inner life seriously before the crisis lands, not because you're currently in difficulty, but because you understand that whatever you build now is exactly what you'll be standing on when the ground eventually shifts. That's not pessimism. It's the most sophisticated form of optimism there is. The belief that life is worth being fully equipped to live. Chapter 15. Who you become on the other side. There's a version of you that exists on the other side of everything in this book. Not a perfect version. One that never struggles, never panics, never feels the full weight of what life delivers. But a version fundamentally different in its relationship to difficulty. This isn't a motivational fantasy. It's the natural, documented outcome of practicing these ideas consistently, with real commitment over real time. What changes first, and most noticeably, is your response time. The gap between something hard happening and your reaction to it. An untrained mind responds almost instantly, driven by the alarm system before your reasoning has any say. A trained mind still feels the initial surge. The training was never meant to eliminate that, and you wouldn't want it to. But it builds, through thousands of small chosen responses, a reliable pause between what happens and what you do about it. And in that pause lives everything. The chance to ask what's actually happening here, what matters most right now, what the person you're committed to being would do next. What changes next is the quality of your presence with other people. Someone who's done this work, regulated their own nervous system, held emotion with distance instead of being consumed by it, caught and rewritten their own worst stories, brought real stillness into their days, becomes, almost inevitably, a different kind of presence to be around, more attentive, less defended, able to hear hard things without shutting down or escalating. People feel this difference even when they can't name it, the difference between someone who's physically present and someone who's actually here. What changes after that is your relationship with uncertainty itself. For most people, uncertainty is the engine driving most of their anxiety. The gap between what they know and what they need to know feels intolerable, a space that has to be filled immediately with either information or worry. A trained mind, through the accumulated practice of sitting with the unresolved, develops something that can only be called genuine tolerance for ambiguity. Not comfort with everything being unknown, but the capacity to stay functional, grounded, even curious, in the face of what hasn't been determined yet. That tolerance isn't passivity, it's freedom. The release of enormous energy that used to be spent trying to resolve every open question before life resolved it on its own. And there's a change in the texture of your ordinary days, the days when nothing in particular is wrong. Most people, even on those days, don't experience real peace. They experience a low-level waiting, a background hum of unease, a quiet suspicion that the absence of crisis is only temporary, and that fully relaxing would be naive. That's the posture of a nervous system conditioned to expect threat, never given consistent proof that rest is actually safe. Over time, a trained mind unlearns this posture, not completely, not permanently. Difficulty will always return the stress response to something like its old intensity for a while. But as a baseline, the waiting quiets, the vigilance softens, and what shows up instead is something most people have quietly wanted their whole lives and never quite trusted themselves to have. A genuine, embodied, everyday sense of being okay. It's worth being honest about what doesn't change, because any promise otherwise would be dishonest. Hard things will still happen. Loss will still arrive without warning. People will still disappoint you. There will still be mornings when the anxiety runs high and your resources feel thin. This work doesn't erase any of that. What it reliably does, the longer and more genuinely you practice it, is change the duration, the intensity, and the meaning of those experiences. The hard thing still lands, but you recover faster. The panic still rises, but it doesn't stay as long or go as deep. The story still turns dark sometimes, but you catch it sooner and rewrite it better. Every repetition compounds. The return on this kind of inner work is extraordinary, and it pays out for the rest of your life. It's worth being honest about what doesn't change, because any promise otherwise would be dishonest. Hard things will still happen. Loss will still arrive without warning. People will still disappoint you. There will still be mornings when the anxiety runs high and your resources feel thin. This work doesn't erase any of that. What it reliably does, the longer and more genuinely you practice it, is change the duration, the intensity, and the meaning of those experiences. The hard thing still lands, but you recover faster. The panic still rises, but it doesn't stay as long or go as deep. The story still turns dark sometimes, but you catch it sooner and rewrite it better. Every repetition compounds. The return on this kind of inner work is extraordinary, and it pays out for the rest of your life. Somewhere in your life right now, one of these 15 chapters is already the one you need most. The breath, the story, the anchor, the honest conversation you've been avoiding. You don't need to master all of them at once, and trying to will only leave you more overwhelmed than when you started. Pick the one chapter that spoke loudest to whatever you're actually carrying today, and practice just that one deliberately for the next 30 days. Let the rest wait. Calm was never built in a single sitting. It's built exactly the way everything durable is built. One small, unglamorous, repeated choice, made on an ordinary day nobody else is watching, until one day it's simply who you are. This was never a method for avoiding hardship. It was never a philosophy for people whose lives are already smooth. It's a complete, practiced architecture of inner strength, built for exactly the life you're actually living, with all its difficulty and all its uncertainty, and all the quiet, irreplaceable beauty that exists right alongside it, available to anyone present enough to notice. You've done the reading. You've heard the ideas. Now comes the only part that actually matters, the living of it. One practiced breath, one grounded choice, one honest story, one moment of returning to what's real at a time. That is how calm is built. And once it's built deeply enough, it doesn't leave.